It was supposed to be just another lonely winter night. Eleanor, an elderly widow living in a remote cabin, had no idea her life was about to change forever. When faint cries echoed through the storm, she opened her door and found two tiny puppies shivering and close to death in the snow. She brought them inside, warmed them by the fire, and thought she had saved them. But the next morning, her peaceful home turned into a scene of chaos. Police cars surrounded her cabin, red and blue lights flashing, officers shouting for her to open the door. What could two helpless dogs possibly have done to bring the police to her doorstep? The answer would shock everyone. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The wind howled through the pines like a chorus of ghosts, carrying sharp needles of snow that lashed against the windows of Eleanor's small log cabin. The old woman sat in her rocking chair, a wool blanket draped over her frail shoulders, listening to the storm rage outside. Winters in the mountains had always been unforgiving, but this night felt colder, darker, and lonelier than most. At 72, Eleanor was no stranger to solitude. Since her husband's passing, her days were filled with quiet routines, stoking the fire, brewing tea, and watching the seasons change through her frosted window panes. She found comfort in the silence, though sometimes the silence weighed heavily on her heart. The storm pressed on, rattling the wooden walls of her home. Eleanor tightened her blanket, trying to ignore the eerie whistles of the wind. She was just about to set her teacup down when something broke through the storm's roar, a faint sound. It was soft, almost lost in the blizzard, yet unmistakable, a cry her heart skipped. At first she thought it was her imagination, but then it came again, clearer this time, high-pitched, trembling, and desperate. Eleanor froze, gripping her chair. What could possibly be out there? In weather that could freeze a person within minutes. She rose slowly, her bones stiff but determined, and shuffled to the door. The cries grew louder with every step. With a trembling hand, she unlatched the lock, bracing herself against the icy gust that burst inside as she pulled the door open. And there, half buried in snow, were two tiny figures, their eyes wide and pleading. Puppies, shivering. Shriek and clinging to life, Eleanor gasped. The coldest night of the year had just become unforgettable. The sight of the puppies nearly broke Eleanor's heart. Their tiny bodies were trembling violently, snow clinging to their fur like icy shackles. Their eyes, though clouded with exhaustion, glimmered with a desperate plea that pierced through the storm. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She stepped into the snow, the bitter cold biting through her boots instantly. Kneeling carefully, she reached out with trembling hands. The first pup whimpered weakly as she scooped it up, its body shockingly light, its paws stiff from the freezing ground. The second tried to nuzzle closer to its sibling, as though sharing what little warmth it had left. Shh, it's all right now, Eleanor whispered, her voice soft against the roar of the blizzard. She tucked the puppies close to her chest, shielding them with her coat. The icy wind clawed at her, but she ignored it, focusing only on the fragile lives she carried. The trek back to the cabin felt endless, each step heavy as snow piled against her legs. But finally she stumbled back through the doorway, kicking it shut behind her. The sudden warmth of the firelight wrapped around them like a miracle. Eleanor laid the puppies on a thick blanket by the hearth, their tiny bodies curling instinctively toward the flames. They whimpered faintly, then quieted, their eyes fluttering closed as the heat seeped back into their frozen bones. Eleanor rubbed them gently with another blanket, tears prickling her eyes. "You're safe now," she murmured, her voice trembling. "I've got you." For a moment, as she sat watching them, she felt a flicker of joy, a spark of life in her lonely cabin. She didn't know where they had come from or why fate had brought them to her door. All she knew was that she couldn't let them go. The cabin, once filled only with the crackle of fire, now pulsed with quiet life. Eleanor sat cross-legged on the rug, her hands gently rubbing the puppies' tiny paws, coaxing warmth back into them. Their shivers slowly eased, though their whimpers tugged at her heart like needles. She rose carefully and shuffled into the kitchen. From the pantry, she pulled out a bowl of milk and warmed it on the stove. Years of caring for strays had taught her little tricks, and tonight those instincts guided her every move. She poured the milk into a shallow dish and placed it near the hearth. At first, the puppies were too weak to move, their eyes half closed. Eleanor dipped her finger into the milk and touched it to their lips. One pup flicked its tongue hesitantly, then began lapping eagerly. The other soon followed, their fragile bodies driven by hunger. Relief washed over her as she watched them feed, a small smile tugging at her lips. When their bellies were finally full, the puppies curled together in the blanket, their tiny bodies pressed against each other for comfort. Eleanor tucked the fabric tighter around them, brushing a gentle hand over their heads. "You poor souls," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. No one should be left out in the cold like that. The firelight flickered across her tired face, but in her eyes shone a warmth that matched the flames. For years, Eleanor had lived alone, but tonight, she felt a spark of companionship she hadn't known she was missing. As the storm raged outside, she leaned back in her chair, listening to the soft breaths of the sleeping pups. For the first time in a long time, the cabin didn't feel empty. It felt alive. As the fire crackled low and the storm outside clawed at the walls, Eleanor settled into her rocking chair, her eyes never leaving the puppies. They lay curled together, their small chests rising and falling in unison. But something about them unsettled her. They were too calm. Most strays she had rescued in the past were restless, crying, pacing, whimpering. But these two stared at her with a quiet intensity, their dark eyes glinting in the firelight as though they understood far more than they should. Eleanor rubbed her temples, trying to shake the thought away. "You're just tired," she muttered to herself. It's been a long night, yet as the hours passed, she noticed more. Whenever the wind howled, the puppies didn't flinch. Instead, they lifted their heads, ears perked, listening with the focus of seasoned guards. When the floor creaked under Eleanor's steps, they followed her movements carefully, their gaze never leaving her. At one point, she leaned down to adjust the blanket. To her surprise, the pups didn't shy away. Instead, they pressed closer, almost as if they were protecting her. Eleanor sank back into her chair, her heart thudding softly. It was strange but comforting. These weren't ordinary strays, they had a presence, a calm strength that seemed out of place for creatures so young. The night grew colder, but Eleanor no longer felt alone. As the storm raged on, she drifted into sleep, lulled by the rhythm of the crackling fire and the steady, watchful eyes of the dogs. She had no way of knowing that by morning, her act of kindness would turn into something far bigger and far more dangerous than she ever imagined. The storm had finally quieted by dawn, leaving the mountain wrapped in a heavy, eerie silence. Sunlight crept through the frosted windows of Eleanor's cabin, casting pale beams across the floor. She stirred awake in her chair, stiff from the long night. The fire had burned low, but the warmth still lingered. Her eyes fell immediately on the puppies. They were awake, sitting side by side, alert and silent as if they had been waiting for her. Eleanor smiled faintly, rubbing her sore neck. "Good morning, little ones," she whispered. But before she could rise, a sound shattered the stillness. Tires crunching against ice. Doors slamming. Voices barking orders. Eleanor's heart skipped. She shuffled to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. What she saw sent a chill through her veins. The quiet clearing in front of her cabin was no longer empty. At least 6 police cars stood in the snow, their lights flashing red and blue against the white landscape. Officers moved swiftly, fanning out with radios crackling, their breath visible in the frozen air. Some carried rifles. Eleanor gasped, stumbling back from the window. "What on earth?" she whispered. The pounding came next, heavy fists against her door, shaking the wooden frame. "Ma'am, open up." "This is the police." The puppies didn't flinch. They remained calm, their eyes trained on the door, ears twitching as if they had expected this. Eleanor's pulse thundered in her ears. Why would the police surround her cabin? And why now, just after she had taken in 2 freezing strays? Her act of kindness had turned overnight into a mystery that was about to change everything. The pounding on the door grew louder, rattling the frame as snow fell from the eaves. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She clutched the blanket around her shoulders, staring at the 2 puppies. They sat motionless, their eyes fixed on the door as though they already knew who was on the other side. "Ma'am, open the door immediately," a commanding voice boomed. "This is official police business." Eleanor's trembling hand reached for the latch, then hesitated. What could the police possibly want with her? She was just an old woman who had taken in 2 helpless animals. Another knock thundered through the cabin. "We know the dogs are inside." Her heart sank. The dogs? Gathering her courage, Eleanor pulled the door open. A blast of icy air swept in, along with the sight of 4 armed officers on her porch. Behind them, others circled the cabin, scanning the property with flashlights. One of the officers, tall and broad-shouldered, stepped forward. "Ma'am, we need to see the animals you took in last night." His tone was firm but not unkind. Eleanor's voice shook. "They were freezing. I just wanted to help them." "They're only puppies." The officer exchanged a tense glance with his partner. "Please step aside." Fear twisted in Eleanor's stomach. She looked back at the pups, who now stood on the rug, heads high, watching the officers with unnerving calm. "I don't understand," Eleanor whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. "What's going on?" The officer's jaw tightened. "Those aren't just strays. You're harboring something much more serious than you realize." Eleanor's knees felt weak as the officer stepped inside, his boots thudding against the wooden floor. The other policemen followed, their flashlights cutting through the dim cabin light, sweeping across the walls until they landed on the 2 puppies. The pups didn't cower. They didn't whimper. They stood side by side, their bodies small but their gaze steady, meeting the officer's eyes with unsettling calm. "There they are," one officer muttered. Eleanor clutched the back of her chair for support. "Please, someone tell me what this is about. They were dying in the snow. I couldn't leave them out there." The lead officer's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained grave. "Ma'am, you did what any good person would. But these aren't ordinary dogs." Eleanor blinked. "What do you mean?" "They're just puppies." The officer crouched near them, careful not to make sudden movements. "These are highly trained canines. They were part of a police unit working on a critical case. They went missing last night during an armed raid gone wrong." Eleanor's breath caught. "Police dogs, but they're just babies." "Not babies," the officer corrected. "Young, yes, but already trained. They were carrying evidence when they disappeared. Evidence we can't afford to lose." Eleanor's eyes widened. She glanced at the pups who had saved their strength for survival, who had trusted her kindness. "You're saying they weren't abandoned?" The officer stood, his face grim. "No, ma'am. They were being hunted. And if whoever was chasing them finds out they're here, you could be in danger too." The cabin felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. Eleanor's act of kindness had not just saved lives. It had placed her squarely in the middle of a storm she never saw coming. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest as the officers closed in on the puppies. The pups pressed against her legs, their tiny bodies trembling, not from cold this time, but from the tension filling the room. She instinctively placed a hand over them as if shielding them from the world. The lead officer extended his arm. "Ma'am, we need to take them now. They're evidence in an ongoing investigation." Eleanor shook her head, her voice breaking. "Evidence? These are living, breathing souls. They're not just evidence, they're scared, hungry, and they trusted me." The officer's stern expression softened. "I understand, but if they stay here, you could be putting yourself in danger. The people after them are dangerous criminals." "If they find this cabin, I've lived through storms, loss, and loneliness," Eleanor interrupted, tears brimming in her eyes. "But I will not stand by and hand over 2 helpless creatures without knowing they'll be safe." The room fell silent, the crackle of the fire the only sound. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. One of them muttered, "She's braver than half the men I know." Eleanor looked down at the pups, who gazed back at her with those steady, knowing eyes. She felt the weight of her decision pressing hard against her chest. If she let them go, she risked betraying their trust. If she kept them, she risked her own safety. Her wrinkled hand tightened around the blanket. "Tell me the truth," she said firmly, looking straight at the officer. "If I give them to you, will they be safe? Will they be treated as more than evidence?" The officer hesitated, his silence speaking louder than words. Eleanor's heart clenched. She realized her choice wasn't simple at all. It was a fight between duty, fear, and compassion. The officer finally exhaled, his breath fogging in the cold air of the cabin. He looked at Eleanor, then at the pups huddled by her side, and spoke in a lower, more honest tone. "They were part of a K-9 training program," he explained, "but not just any program. These dogs were being raised to track weapons and contraband for a federal case. Last night, during a raid on a smuggling ring, the unit was ambushed. Shots were fired. In the chaos, the young dogs slipped away, still carrying sensitive tags on their collars." Eleanor's eyes widened. "Smugglers? Here in these mountains? The officer nodded grimly. The gang operates out of these woods. They'd stop at nothing to get rid of evidence or silence anyone who stood in their way. That's why when you took them in, unknowingly you became part of this. Eleanor felt her stomach twist. She looked down at the pups, suddenly seeing them in a new light. They weren't just strays. They were survivors. They had escaped not just the storm, but men who wanted them gone. Another officer added, "We tracked them all night. Their paw prints led us straight here. When we saw them missing from the raid, we feared the worst. But you—" He paused, his voice softening. "You saved them." Eleanor's throat tightened. She remembered their pleading eyes in the snow, the way they had pressed against her warmth without hesitation. They hadn't just been searching for shelter. They had been searching for someone to trust. She wiped a tear from her cheek. "All I did was open my door." The lead officer shook his head gently. "Sometimes that's enough to change everything." The cabin was quiet now, the storm outside reduced to soft flakes drifting through the trees. Inside, the glow of the fire cast long shadows across the walls as Eleanor sat with the two pups nestled at her feet. The officers prepared to leave, their radios crackling with updates from the ongoing operation. The lead officer stepped toward her, his expression softened by gratitude. "Ma'am, you've done more than you know. These dogs could have died out there, and with them the evidence we needed. Because of you, we still have a chance to bring those men down." Eleanor stroked the puppies gently, her wrinkled hands trembling. "I didn't save evidence," she whispered. "I saved lives," the officer nodded. "And in doing so, you may have saved others too." As the police escorted the pups toward their vehicle, one of them paused, turning back to look at Eleanor. Its dark eyes lingered on her, filled with something that looked like recognition, a silent promise that this bond, however brief, would not be forgotten. Her chest tightened. For a moment, she wondered if she'd ever see them again. But just as the officers loaded the dogs into their truck, another call came over the radio. "We're short on safe handlers. Leave them with the woman. She's proven trustworthy." The officer hesitated, then looked back at Eleanor with a small smile. "Looks like they're staying for now." Eleanor's eyes widened, then softened into tears. She bent down, hugging the pups tightly. For the first time in years, her cabin didn't feel lonely. It felt like home. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell so you never miss more unbelievable true stories. And tell us in the comments, would you have opened the door on that freezing night?